This is Garis, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW, written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. This is flyer number 673, entitled How Politicians Can Solve the Birthrate Crash. Description. This flyer shows how politicians can solve the birth rate crash that threatens, if sustained, to wipe out whole populations. It lists 3 main causes of this birth rate crash, namely 1. Kids are too expensive, hence mothers need to be given a hefty maternity wage while they are at home raising very small children. 2. That feminism has taught women to have their own careers and not be parasites on men, not be dependent on men, which the masculists agree with up to a point. And 3, that the gender laws must be menfaired if young men are to be willing to be fathers again. Otherwise they'll continue to reject marriage and paternity, preferring to spend their money on themselves, that is, living the MGTOW lifestyle. Now the flyer itself in 2 parts. How Politicians Can Solve the Birth Rate Crash by Prof. Dr. Hugo de Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. If I were a thoughtful, longer-term thinking politician, I would be worried about the implications of the crash in the birth rate that is occurring across the planet. In Seoul, capital of South Korea, the birth rate is projected to be an alarming 0.59 children per woman in 2024 and 0.68 in the country as a whole. Seoul's president, Yoon Suk-yeol, has declared, brackets, quoting Microsoft's co-pilot, in brackets, quotes, a national emergency on population, in quotes, implementing measures to expand cash support for newborns and address the declining birth rate trend. The government's efforts focus on work-life balance, childcare and housing support. There's a reference that you can click on. Other countries are not so far behind. For example, China's is 1.18, Spain's is 1.19, Italy's is 1.31, Canada's is 1.33, Japan's is 1.37, Germany's is 1.54, Russia's is 1.54, Hungary's is 1.55, France's is 1.78, the US is 1.78. Any educated person knows that the replacement birth rate is 2.1 children per woman. That is, each woman needs to replace herself and her male mate for the population to remain stable. Obviously, the above stats show clearly that that is definitely not the case. So given the above birth rates, let's ask the question, quote, in how many generations will the current population of a country be down to less than 1% of its current population? Question mark, end quote. In the case of South Korea, each generation is reduced to about 1/3, that is 0.68 over 2.1, of its previous generation. In brackets, actually, people live about 3+ generations, so this model needs to be refined, but it gives a rough approximation. Close brackets. So a generation from now, South Korea's population will be its current value times 1/3. A generation after that, its population will be its current value times 1/3 times 1/3. So what will the population be after after n generations? Obviously, it will be the current population times 1/3 raised to the nth power. You can say that South Korea's population will be roughly 1/100th of its current size in a bit over 4 generations. 1/3 of 1/3 of 1/3 of 1/3 is 1/81. So South Korea's population will be roughly 81 times smaller in a mere 4 generations. No wonder the South Korean politicians are scared shitless. Sooner or later, politicians will be forced, as has already happened in South Korea, to take drastic steps to prop up the birth rate, and in capital letters, or whole populations get wiped out in just a handful of generations! Exclamation mark 3 times. So, what can these politicians do? Question mark. If I were the chairman of an investigative committee commissioned by a government to look into the problem of the birth rate crash, I would commence the investigation with an examination of the factors that are causing the birth rate crash and then try to counter them. So what are the major causes of the birth rate crash? Question mark. This flyer aims to contribute towards answering this question by adding to the usual causes, that is, by introducing the main reasons why men are refusing to reproduce. There are at least 2 other major non-man related causes of the birth crash. One is that it's just too expensive to have a kid, so millions of couples are simply preferring to spend their money on themselves. When a mother gives birth and decides to stay at home for several years until the child goes to kindergarten, the total income of the couple halves, more or less. This drop in income can be a real shock to a couple, so they decide having a kid is not worth it. In the past, before reliable contraception, not having a kid was often not an option. With unprotected sex, women kept getting pregnant. But in the age of the pill and modern contraception, reliable birth control is an option. So typically now, women are choosing to have 0, 1 or 2 kids, which is not enough to reproduce the current generation. Another major reason why couples choose not to have kids is that the wife, the girlfriend in the couple, chooses her career over being a mother, and hence lowers the birth rate. A third reason is that the feminists took over the divorce courts in the 70s and made divorce so toxic for men that 2/3 of young men now in many countries choose not to marry, not to be fathers, since they refuse to face a 1 chance in 4 of being financially butchered in the feminist-controlled divorce courts. This third reason is probably the most significant cause of the crash in the birth rate, but today's gender politicians, who are starting to consider measures to increase the birth rate, are largely ignorant of this factor due to their ignorance of masculist ideas and are unaware of the toxicity of the divorce courts for men. So what can be done to increase the birth rate so that we do not wipe ourselves out? I now provide answers to the 3 main causes of the birth rate crash given above. Too expensive. When a woman decides to stop working to stay at home raising the kid, the couple's total income often halves, roughly. So to prevent this shock in total family income, the government needs to provide the couple with the lost income. In practice, this could be assessed by finding the average income of the mother over the previous 2 years, and that figure becomes her maternity wage for the number of years she spends at home full-time raising the kid. If she has a second kid, then she gets a larger maternity wage to encourage her and her male partner to have a second kid, which is needed on average for all couples if we are to achieve replacement rate. The tax burden needed to pay millions of mothers a maternity wage would be considerable, so it will be necessary for governments to promote the idea that reproduction is a societal responsibility, that is, that everyone, that is, the whole society, pays to reproduce and raise the next generation via taxation. Governments can push the idea of civic duty onto couples to have 2 kids and be punished if they have less. Those individuals who choose to have no kids will need to be punished more severely. More on this later. 2. Women's careerism. Feminism has fostered the idea of female careerism over the past half-century or so. Feminism has preached to women the idea of financial independence from men, not being a house slave to men, and billions of women have found this argument very persuasive. Some Manospherians have proposed that women be pushed back to the kitchen, to be housewives again, as were women in the 50s and earlier. The masculists, that's men's libbers, are hotly opposed to this idea, since masculists have a hatred of fluffies, who by definition are traditional women who expect to live off the money and labour of a man for decades of his life, thus manslaving and divorce raping him for decades. Masculists see fluffies as vermin to be wiped from the gene pool by being totally ignored by men, masculisted men, not even pumped and dumped, forcing such women to rot on the shelf, dying slow, miserable, manless, childless, loveless, sexless deaths. Masculists put enormous moral pressure on women to FIP up, in brackets, that is, become FIPs, equals financially independent persons, close brackets, by getting career competent educations at high school and college, so that they can be FIPs as adults and not, fluffy style, expect to parasite off the labour and money of a man. But the next generation needs to be grown and raised, so how can masculinist career expectations on women be reconciled with the need for women to reproduce more and hence to career less, if they are to stay at home when the children are small? This is the end of part 1.